talk about our literature for today. We're going to be talking about Ernest Hemingway, but before we do, let's just talk briefly about A Worn Path. You were to have read that for today. Hopefully, you saw in that the conflict was man versus society, and poor old Phoenix Jackson versus society, and you saw kind of the patronizing way society treated her, and so that was a conflict going on there. Our tone, would you have say it was critical, neutral, or sympathetic? Which one did you think? Well, if you said sympathetic, you are correct because the author made us feel sympathy for poor Phoenix as she was making this trip to town to get the medication for her grandson. Hopefully, you saw the two different, the literal and the figurative meaning for a worn path. Literal mean, of course, is the actual path that she had worn out from going to town and back to get her medicine or get the medicine for her son. And then the figurative meaning, of course, would be like the path of life. Okay? All right. Today we're going to talk about Ernest Hemingway, one of the most controversial and highly publicized writers of modern times. He was born in a Chicago suburb, but he often would come to northern Michigan to hunt and fish and kind of get away in the woods of northern Michigan. He enjoyed that. He was he enjoyed sports. He enjoyed fishing, hunting. Later in his life, he enjoyed watching bullfighting, and he would go on big game hunts like to Africa and other places like that. He really enjoyed that kind of thing. And his style became very famous, or he was known for his style, let's put it that way. He liked to write in very short, succinct sentences, nouns, and verbs, avoiding the use of adjectives. He joined the Red Cross Ambulance Corps in 1918 for World War I. He had tried after graduating from high school to enlist in the Army, but he was turned down because he had an eye injury. And so then he joined the Red Cross Ambulance Corps and was sent to Europe. So in Italy, he was an ambulance driver. After just 3 weeks of duty, he was wounded by shrapnel, but he managed to carry a fatally wounded Italian soldier to safety to a first aid station. And so the Italian government awarded him a medal for valor. And then he was allowed to fight as an infantry man in the Italian army for the rest of the war. And that experience, that whole experience there, is what his book, A Farewell to Arms, which is one of his most successful novels, and that's on your reading list, I believe, for next year, A Farewell to Arms. So some of you might be interested in reading that. But that whole experience is kind of the basis for the book, and the main character in the book goes through these same things, joins the Italian army, and he gets injured, and all these things. When he returned back after the war, he married Hadley Richardson, but that was the first of 4 wives. Sadly, he ended up divorcing and getting remarried 3 more times. But they got married, they moved to Paris, and he joined with the expatriates there and with a group of Ezra Pound and Gertrude Stein. And she's the one who kind of gave them that nickname, the Lost Generation, to him and the other American writers in Paris during the 1920s. His first major novel was called The Sun Also Rises, became a bestseller, and that one kind of established his reputation as a writer, and that one's about a man and set in Spain mostly, with bullfighting and that kind of thing in that novel there. Now, you should be cautioned against just picking up any Ernest Hemingway novel and saying, oh, this has got to be a great one, it's by Ernest Hemingway. His only novel that would be free from objectionable elements that are in most of his works would be The Old Man and the Sea, which some of you might have read in 9th grade. So you have to just read with discretion as you read Hemingway. I've read both A Farewell to Arms and The Sun Also Rises. There are things in it, of course, as Christians that we would not agree with, but you just have to have discretionary reading as you're reading his things. He also traveled widely for the next 30 years. He went big game hunting in Africa, was a war correspondent in the Spanish Civil War and in World War II. He lived in Key West, Florida for 10 years. Then he moved to Cuba, lived in Cuba for 20 years, and continued writing. He stayed there until 1960 when Fidel Castro started his kind of anti-American stance, and so it was best that he leave Cuba. So he did, and he ended up going to Idaho. Um, he believed, and he even said this himself, for a true writer, each book should be a new beginning where he tries again for something that is beyond attainment. He should always try for something that has never been done or that others have tried and failed. Then sometimes, with great luck, he will succeed. So he thought that a writer should try something new or something that hasn't been accomplished every time he writes. He should try something new. Now, he preferred writing novels to short stories. He's very economical, streamlined writing style. You'll see that as you're reading. It's very simple, very straightforward. His characters reject traditional values, and you'll see that as you read, not so much in the one that we're reading, the selection here, Big Two-Hearted River, but in his other novels like A Farewell to Arms and The Sun Also Rises, you'll see that just rejection of traditional values. You'll also see that this, particularly this Big Two-Hearted River, the main character is from a selection of stories about a main character named Nick Adams. Nick Adams' story closely parallels Hemingway's own biography. Um, in this selection, Big Two-Hearted River, Nick is taking this fishing expedition, trying to restore his emotional stability after being in the war. So it's very similar to what Hemingway did when he came back from World War One and tried to heal himself by going to nature, going fishing, and stuff like that. You might also find that his writing habits are kind of interesting. He most of the time stood while he was writing. He also would use pencil and paper for his writing, unless things were going extremely well with his writing, and then he would use a typewriter. He would every day record how many words he had written for that day. Usually it would range from 450 to 1250. Whenever he planned to go fishing, so he was going to be gone, he would put in some extra work ahead of time so that he could, take off that extra time. He wouldn't fall behind in his schedule, in his mind. And here's another glimpse into his his writing process. This is a quote from him. When I'm working on a book or a story, I write every morning as soon after first light as possible. There's no one to disturb you, and it is cool or cold, and you come to your work and you warm as you write. You read what you have written, and as you always stop when you know what's going to happen next, you go on from there. You write until you come to a place where you still have your juice and you know what will happen next, and you stop. And you try to live through until the next day when you hit it again. I rewrote the ending to Farewell to Arms, the last page of it, 39 times before I was satisfied in order to get the words right. So that's kind of amazing. Farewell to Arms, that he wrote the ending there 39 times before he got it just the way that he wanted it. Unfortunately, he was plagued by some depression, possibly some people think maybe some mental illness, and he began seriously considering suicide, which, interestingly enough, in his novel For Whom the Bell Tolls, he had the hero in that novel condemn suicide as a way of resolving problems, and Hemingway's own father had committed suicide, and Hemingway looked on that as an act of weakness. But unfortunately, on July 2nd, 1961, he took his own life. And there'll be a little bit more about that in the YouTube video that I'm going to show you. You'll notice that his sentences, as we read, are usually short, simple. The effect he wanted was crispness and clarity, and he certainly achieves that. As I mentioned, he wrote about men and women who kind of had thrown aside their values, and his definition of morality kind of became the creed of that generation of writer. This is what he said: I know only that what is moral is what you feel good after, and what is immoral is what you feel bad after. Of course, it's a very subjective definition. It totally ignores God's laws of morality. It doesn't matter if you feel good or if you feel bad. That can't be your compass. God's word has to be your compass for what is moral and what is right. I'm going to play this little biography video for you. I find it interesting. It's only about 3 minutes long, and hopefully you'll enjoy that.
There's an epidemic spreading. Scientists say it can change your brain.
Ernest Hemingway was one of the most important writers of the 20th century.
He revolutionized the idea of what an American author was, and he was a bigger celebrity in his day and age than we could probably conceive of now. He was the Lady Gaga of his era.
Ernest Miller Hemingway was born in Oak Park, Illinois on July 21st, 1899.
As a young man, Hemingway worked on his school newspaper, and then on graduation, instead of going to college, he went directly to work on newspapers in Kansas City. That background in journalism had a lot to do with his later literary style.
Ernest Hemingway's writing style was significant because he was so brief and seemingly straightforward. Whereas other writers were writing very long sentences, Hemingway came in and stamped on them with his short little sentences, like army boots.
During World War I, Hemingway served as an ambulance driver and then moved to Paris, where he wrote his first novel, The Sun Also Rises, in 1926.
Paris was this amazing confluence of literary talent where you had Hemingway, James Joyce, F. Scott Fitzgerald, Gertrude Stein, T.S. Eliot, and Hemingway immediately impressed all of them, especially Fitzgerald, who brought Hemingway's manuscript, The Sun Also Rises, to his publisher, Charles Scribner. If it hadn't been for Fitzgerald, Hemingway might not be a household name now.
Hemingway's 1929 second novel, A Farewell to Arms, was based on his World War I experiences and was a big success. His personal life, however, was often stormy.
Hemingway had this pathological thing where as soon as he married one woman, he fell in love with another one, usually a much younger one. And this happened over and over.
Ernest Hemingway was married 4 times. With his first wife, Hadley, they had a son, John. With his second wife, Pauline, he had 2 sons, Patrick and Gregory. He was then married to the journalist Martha Gellhorn, and then finally to Mary Welsh.
Hemingway continued to live up to his reputation as a fearless physical writer, as he served as a newspaper war correspondent during the Spanish Civil War and World War II.
In 1951, Ernest Hemingway won the Pulitzer Prize for The Old Man and the Sea.
Hemingway was further honored 3 years later with a Nobel Prize in Literature.
In Ernest Hemingway's later life, he fought depression, anxiety, probably mental illness.
Hemingway suffered from alcoholism, suffered from an ongoing battle with inner demons in his life.
It started to take an intense mental toll. He would have beer and gin for breakfast, and after a while he was no longer a functional alcoholic. His ability to write was gone, and he felt that that was his essence as a human being. That was his point for being on Earth.
Hemingway committed suicide when finally he found that all the virtues that he most valued, self-control and productivity, had come to an end. It was better to go out than simply to flounder on.
Ernest Hemingway died on July 2nd, 1961.
Hemingway's greatest work may have been his life, the life that he lived. He took being a writer from being someone who just sat in a room to someone who not just gobbled up life, but made a show of it.
All right, so that is just a little bit about Ernest Hemingway. So let's get back to our what we're going to read by him, Big Two-Hearted River. That's actually the name of an actual river in northern Michigan. And some critics believe that it implies that there are 2 hearts, possibly one heart is light, which you'll see in like the sunny meadow and the pines, and one is dark, the forbidding swamp that you'll see as you're reading. So that is one possible significance to that title. You'll notice that the main character in here, Nick Adams, focuses on rituals, on doing things that he can just do methodically, unthinkingly, so that he can kind of put his brain on automatic. And so this solitary fishing trip in the northern woods, it's therapeutic as he tries to seek this healing for his troubled mind. It appears that he's deliberately concentrating on something very simple, going fishing, so that he won't have to think. He can just kind of numb his mind, and which is exactly what Hemingway tried to do. So the conflict in this story is obviously man versus himself. And then the tone, as you're reading, you'll see it's a very neutral tone. He's not trying to make us feel sympathetic for Nick or be critical of Nick. It's just very neutral and kind of, matter of fact. So you're going to read this story, Big Two-Hearted River by Ernest Hemingway. And then we will talk about it, and we'll see you next time.